Welcome to the Man Narrative Podcast. I'm your host, Yafa Ares. The following is a conversation with Steve Green. Steve is the head of Central Data Services at the FCA, the Financial Accounting Authority. This department looks after all data management and collection activities for the FCA, as well as running a number of central data advisory, analysis, and insight functions. Hi, Steve. Welcome to the My Narrative Podcast. It's good to have you today.
Thank you. Hi, I'm glad to be here.
Great. So you're coming from the FCA, also known as the Financial Conduct Authority. So would you like to give us an overview and also maybe an introduction of who is Steve and what are you up to at the FCA?
So the FCA is, as you say, the Financial Conduct Authority for the UK. With the Bank of England, we kind of look after the regulatory services around our financial services in the UK. We specifically focus on conduct and behaviour within firms and also look at how kind of prudential risk of firms and the actual activities of most of the smaller firms. We look after about 60,000 firms. So it's a big kind of waterfront of what we do across all of UK financial services. My role in the FCA is kind of two, one of which is I am the head of data. So I look after all of the centralized data governance, data management, data quality functions, but I also have a set of kind of shared data analytics services. I look after the information center, which is our library, where we buy in data and we buy periodicals and newspapers and stuff as well. I also have a bunch of central intelligence service activity, where we run kind of internet web services, intelligence-driven activity, looking at consumer sentiment and things like that. And then the second half of my job is that I'm the program director, I suppose is the easiest way to describe it, for our data strategy. So I look after all kind of large data activities across the FCA, as well as most of the new analytical projects and kind of advanced analytical projects that we're doing, working with colleagues who look after various aspects of that journey.
Wow, you have a lot on your plate.
It's interesting, keeps me awake.
Yeah, I can imagine. Cool. So are you happy to, obviously we could unpack a lot with all the, I guess, hats that you wear at the FCA, but maybe for listeners, talking about the data strategy will be super beneficial.
Yeah, and we published, I mean, on our website, we published about 5 pages worth of information on our data strategy in January last year. So listeners can get a better feel, and there's some pictures there and things like that, but I'm absolutely happy to talk through whatever you'd like to discuss in that on our strategy.
Awesome. Yeah. So maybe let's talk about more, I guess, strategic level, leadership level versus the deep dive into the tools and technical aspects of the data strategy. Maybe you can guide us through the rationale behind the business drivers for the FCA.
So I think there's a few things. One is that we could see that technology was moving around us. So organizations that we regulate were using technology differently, whether it's moving to the cloud, whether it's the use of deep kind of analytical techniques, or whether it's just the pace of change, the pace of the way technology is changing the way we engage with financial services. And so we knew that as an organization, we had to stay on top of that trend. We couldn't fall behind, otherwise, how would we be able to regulate the firms that we look after? So that was the first thing, is that we as an organization needed to keep moving. Clearly, there is also an efficiency drive off the back of that. We have to be better at what we do. We have to look after our firms better. We have to learn the lessons of mistakes that have been made in the past. And bluntly, we also are in a situation where the amount of firms we've looked after has grown over the years, and our organization has not grown commensurately with that. So, we have had growth, but not the level that our firm portfolios have changed. So we have to use data differently. We have to use technology differently to be able to get over that and to understand stuff deeper, to understand what's happening within firms, what are the kind of harms and risk concerns that we have across sectors and across the firms themselves. So that efficiency needs, we have to automate where we can. We have to get after better and deeper insights. And we have to be able to make decisions faster, because there's many more decisions to make. So we were looking at both, how do we deal with the trends in the industry and keeping up? How do we look at our efficiency? And then bluntly, we knew that there was opportunity out there to really change the way we understand financial services and to really change the depth of our understanding and our ability to react quickly. So we've always said that our data strategy is not like some strategies are. Some strategies are mainly around data governance. They're about data control, about data management, data quality, data architecture. And whilst our strategy does care about that, it cares about getting the foundations right. It does that not just for risk purposes, mitigation of risk. It's about hoping that by having more accessible data, better data, easier to understand data, more trustworthy data, that you can then start to drive a real change in the way the business works. So our data strategy touches upon both those foundational activities, but also ultimately how we're going to exploit it better in the business. And so there was a lot of business drive around really considering about the value we can get from our data, not just seeing data as a bit of a defensive thing where we have to protect it and look after it and be safe from it.
That's interesting. So is it fair to say that it's, in the case of your organization, it's the business driving data and not necessarily the FCA becoming data driven?
So I think internally we talk about the FCA becoming data driven and data enabled. Actually, it's probably data enabled is where we are at the moment, where we're using data to enable better decisions, faster decisions. But ultimately, a lot of what we do still requires human agency and human judgment. And so we are still looking at that. But certainly our outcomes are driven by business need. They are not driven by the need for me as a data leader to kind of go, we really should have more advanced analytics, or we should have more interesting AI things, or we should have more data management. It's all been driven based upon, what are the risks we're trying to mitigate? What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve as an organization? How efficiently can we do that? And all of that is ultimately about spotting harm, understanding markets better, intervening more quickly, lowering burden on firms so the cost of regulation comes down if possible, or at least doesn't go up where it doesn't need to, and becoming the efficient organization that drives value for money. So everything we do in the strategy is driven by those business outcomes. But clearly that requires a huge amount of deliverables that are sometimes slightly more back office, your data management stuff, and sometimes more very obvious to the business around new dashboards and new tools and stuff like that.
Yeah, it makes sense. No, it all makes sense. I mean, speaking to various data leaders, it always comes from a clear business needs, and it's supported by the tech. And even some companies, I think I heard them saying we are values driven and data supported, something like that. So it's kind of similar in what you said in being data enabled, supporting better decisions, with still some iterations from obviously individuals across teams. So data,
Sorry, we're just saying we spent a lot of time looking at what other firms were doing and where things had worked or not. And we also reflected on our own previous journey where having kind of data projects that were very obviously just data stuff and, hadn't really kind of gone out with a business outcome in quite the way that we would like it to. Often they just kind of fell short of the value that we wanted to deliver. So, and certainly when we've looked externally, there's been a lot of experiences that we wanted to build upon, learning lessons from other firms where they'd hired lots of data scientists and maybe it hadn't really landed very well. So we decided very early on that whilst there was a bit of build it and they will come, a bit of a showboating what's possible, the vast majority of what we're doing is driven by business need.
Absolutely. And even from a friend who was a CAO at Just Giving, Matt Wigamby, I remember from his book and also just his years of practice saying to me that you could have the best data science teams, but completely fail your data initiatives.
Absolutely.
Right. Going back to things like people, process, culture, structure, and we'll cover that down the line, I'm sure. So going back to your data strategy, FCA's data strategy, obviously data is a huge domain. I'm curious to hear, and I'm sure your listeners too, how did you make sure that your programs, outputs, outcomes, or everything produced were first relevant, reliable, repeatable, and current?
So I think there's always a balance here, and we haven't finished this journey. We are an organization that collects a lot of data, so and some of that has been collected for over a decade. So we are still looking at where some of our data maybe isn't quite as relevant to the way we want to use it today than the way we wanted to use it 10 years ago. So there is a data needs work stream within the strategy around really assessing what we collect as an organization and what we need to collect. And that doesn't just look at the raw data, it looks at its timeliness, it looks at its quality, it looks at the validation verification rules that we have. And we've also been doing work with the Bank of England, which the bank has communicated around what the future of data collection for UK industry might look like. How do we drive kind of machine executable language into our policies and our handbooks so that we can retrieve data much easier, much simpler, and for much lower cost. So there's quite a lot of work going on about that and the data standards we need to make sure that that data we collect is reliable and, and all the kind of good quality stuff that we need to have. We also have quite a lot of engagement with the business, and we will touch upon that on other aspects of the strategy as well. But the ability to get into the business teams, the directors and heads of department, and asking them, what are your business problems? What are the things you can't do at the moment? And then what data do you need to spot, prove, disprove, scale, whatever it might be around your issue or your business outcome you're trying to achieve. And so we are constantly tacking, should we say, around, we've got this new idea, that means we need new data, or we need to change the data, or we need to supplement the data with some external sources to strengthen it. And there's a whole load of that stuff that all of it is really about making sure it's relevant and reliable. We're also increasing our data quality capability in the organization, investing in new tooling, and also actually looking about how data science can help us do that data quality analysis over what can be quite large data sets. And our market oversight team have led that way with some of the work they've done around European legislative data, around MiFID, where we get tens of millions of items a day, and we're constantly checking, what the quality is, asking for resubmissions where we see poor quality, and we are looking at obviously learning those lessons out across the organization.
That's interesting. And I guess as a leader, you get your inspiration from use cases, from your experience, and from things from the environment around you from a business perspective. And although I think you briefly mentioned and say, at the FCA, we looked at other businesses and other companies, or organizations working in the realm of. Do you have any maybe examples or things that you have spotted in terms of change in market dynamics and things that will have an application for the FCA?
I think the kind of, you said earlier that hiring good data scientists is not the only thing you need to do. So I think that the data world is learning that lesson, that mixture of empathy, being able to understand the business need, all of that is in a much better space, I think, than maybe it was 3 or 4 years ago. Certainly when we started this conversation, a lot of people talking at conferences would be much more focusing on the data management, the data science stuff, rather than the broader how to drive transformation kind of conversation. And it feels sometimes like some areas of the kind of data ecosystem are still learning those lessons. So I think there is a lot of stuff there out in industry where we can learn from those companies that have got it right. There are a number of regulators, FINRA in the US, MAS in Singapore, who are really trying to drive this agenda as well. And we do share lessons between ourselves, and we've also learned lessons from some of our external activity around our innovate work, so our sandbox, the way we deal with innovative change. So that cultural change can't be underplayed, getting people to challenge the status quo, getting people to think differently about how they do their day job. That's not easy when people have been doing things a certain way for a while. So we've really brought in the behavioral science, the business change skills into the data domain to make sure that we not just send a product into somebody's lap, but we really reflect upon, making sure the process evolves at the same time, or the organization evolves at the same time. So in our strategy, we have quite a lot of focus on what is the data operating model, what are the teams we need, what's the skills, what's the training. We have leadership culture kind of events with our SLT, so with our senior leadership team. And so we do try and look at it holistically. We look at the platforms, we look at the data management, we look at the advanced analytics, but we're also looking at the culture and, the way people act in an environment that is innovative and will accept and drive change in a much more comfortable manner. So we've certainly taken on that aboard, and my background is mainly IT transformation. So I think IT learned this lesson maybe 20 years ago. IT used to be almost a build it and they will come, everybody needs us, we don't need the business, we know what the future looks like. And I think some areas you still see that in the data space, where there is sometimes a little bit of arrogance about being the new person on the block almost. about we know what's wrong with your business, we know what you can do to change it. And we just have to make sure that that empathy is balanced, that you do get to know why things are working the way they are in the business, because then you can help them get from A to B. If you just tell them what the future looks like, it's very difficult sometimes for people to go on that journey. So we certainly learned a lot of those lessons, I think, both from the way IT used to be, and the way digital services have transformed over the last 10, 15 years, and trying to apply some of those lessons to data. I think also, whenever we speak to firms, I think there is an impression that AI is everywhere almost. It's going out. And actually, a lot of what we've had to do is just get visualization better. Tableau is a big growing company because it's done visualization well and it makes it easy for people. And so we've tried to balance the fact that, again, whilst hiring lots of data science is really important to push the boundaries and to do really clever stuff, actually, we can't forget the things where people just want to be the best analyst in the room. They just want to drive better, I won't say basic analysts, but better kind of non-advanced analytics. And certainly we found that a lot of the early value we've delivered over the last couple of years has been really in just making sure we present our data better, we ask better questions, we get better answers without it needing to have lots of complex modeling and algorithms and things like that. So it is surprising at times how much we've managed to lift the dial by doing the simple stuff better.
I couldn't agree more. I'm smiling because, before, I guess, tackling and doing all the cool parts of, I guess, substitute of AI, so machine learning and prescriptive, predictive analytics and all that good stuff. Sometimes, it's dashboarding, reporting, and even one layer down, sorting out the data, the quality of data that you may have in your organization. So how do you balance obviously you operate very much on a holistic level, but also you work closely with teams, and so you can have this sort of long-term vision, but also I guess you have to make an impact, right, with your team. So how do you balance the need to be strategic with quick wins to demonstrate progress at the FCA?
So we've certainly had a mindset which talks about start small, but with always an intention to scale fast and to see what the future looks like. So everything we've done from a strategic perspective is aligning ourselves for what an enterprise-wide organization that's data-enabled looks like. The big stuff, putting in the basics around data lake and stuff like that. But everything we did in the early days particularly was around picking those use cases where we thought it was pretty obvious that we'd be able to sell to the executives that, look how quick we've managed to get you an answer that previously you've not been able to get to. Look how easy it is to understand the data when historically maybe it was a 60,000 line spreadsheet that nobody could visualize in a meaningful way. And so we've picked a few examples, really 3 years ago actually, which we took in front of our executive and went, look, we can change a lot with a 12-week project, or what, is pretty small stuff at times. And some of those then became, I suppose, an organizational transformation piece where we picked an area of the organization and we showed that by combining the data science work, by combining better visualization, by combining a conversation on risk appetite and where you wanted to draw the line of intervention and activity, by combining change to business process and the skills in the team, that we could make dramatic changes, not 5 or 10%, but a factor of efficiency across areas of the organization. And so we picked a kind of big end-to-end use case that could show that by knitting it together, we can make a difference. We picked 2 or 3 quite pretty looking pilots that became very obvious that you could show something in a meaningful way and make it stick, and it was easy to understand. And so whilst also planning for what the future looked like from a large ecosystem. So we started to put in place the foundational services, the ability to scale our teams, the analytics community in the organization, that whole ecosystem of a good data-enabled organization was put in place in parallel to winning over the front line around the possibilities. And we're now at a place where those quick wins are being industrialized across the organization. The lessons from those early work has been disrupted somewhat by COVID, although they did also help with COVID. Some of our work on COVID was very much helped by the work we'd done in the previous year, about the way we could pivot our resources quickly in our teams because we understood the markets better because of our use of data and the better visualization techniques that we deployed. So it's been really positive in that sense, but obviously COVID also slows us down when it comes to transformation and change, in the sense of there are teams who are very busy dealing with what's happening on the ground. And so there are some things that maybe we haven't moved quite as quickly over the last year. But certainly the intention was always to kind of start small, but to kind of think big and to scale quickly. And that's allowed us to deal with the bumps as they've arrived, and allowed us to pivot and flex as different areas want to move at different paces.
Yeah, it all makes sense. I have the same actually, so slogan or punchline, but I think in reverse order, maybe I think big, start small, move fast, but it's the same. It's the same, but yeah, it's but again, going back to what you said earlier around sometimes just start with small but low-hanging fruits, but prove the business case, win the trust of various stakeholders, frontline users, consumers across the business.
And we're asking an organization to spend a lot of money on developing these capabilities, and to do that without any real proof that it's going to make a difference is very difficult. So you've got to go for that low-hanging fruit, and it doesn't mean you have to sweep up all the low-hanging fruit. Some of them will take time just to get around. They won't be in the priority areas, but certainly picking the ones that were most visual, most obvious, and really the ones where it wasn't that we were just automating something that could be done today. We were delivering an insight that could not be gotten today through manual means. You'd have had to throw thousands of people at it. And yet by using fairly straightforward AI, by using network analytics and things like that, you can see patterns in data that you just couldn't see before. And so those types of use cases became really valuable for those pilots.
No, it makes sense. So you've managed and led of multiple projects. Do you want to share with our listeners, because our listeners is like data practitioners all the way to also, the full IT digital stack, so transformation and all of that. So how tell us your secret sauce and how you've managed to avoid a sort of ivory tower scenario within the FCA when you deployed and integrated this horizontal program across your organization?
So part of it is getting out there. So you need to understand your business. You need to be able to empathize. And you also need to realize that if you're really going after business problems, a data science team in the basement is not going to fix it for you. You have to come out of your tower and talk to people. Also, we've been very clear that the way we hire staff is quite balanced, quite diverse, so that we get different opinions. So again, what we don't have is a single really clever view, but ultimately it's still a single view. Everybody has the same maths or data science background. Everyone kind of went to the same universities, and everybody's just talking to each other. so we avoid that very clearly. So some of our data scientists are actually embedded in the business. So they really sit under kind of business line management, so they can feel the issues, really understand the challenges. We also do things like we hire differently. So we send out interview questions in advance so that we don't just get extrovert, confident staff who win the interviews. We get people who've had a chance to reflect, which in a data world is quite important, time to reflect and to really understand your data. So we have quite different hiring practices to how we used to hire, to try and make sure we get diverse talent through the door as well. But bluntly, we also, we tell people not to be arrogant. We may be one of the teams that have been tasked with helping drive the change. But as I said earlier, that team needs to be multidisciplinary. It needs to include your data scientists and your visualization experts and your UX people and your IT people and your business change people. That kind of classic transformation program skill set. But it also needs the business. The best programs I've ever worked on, you've had business leaders front and center in your committees, in your working groups, defining your use cases. And I think it's very difficult to get great success if what you do is you just give a problem to the data science team and then step away and ask them to come back in 12 weeks. Firstly, that's not very agile, the kind of 2-week sprint cycle. You want people to be engaging all the way. You want it to be building with the business. You want to pilot it with them and know it's going to iterate. Firstly, as you say, that builds the excitement and the value more quickly, but it also means that you build the trust and the empathy, and it means that for the next project, you don't have to start from scratch. You know the business, you're working through it. So we've been very clear to our teams that our operating model has to include some disaggregation of skill set and knowledge. It has to include the business people, so not just the new people who've joined. And that really allows us to kind of drive out that ivory tower kind of mentality. I think what we also is we have lots of different streams. So because they're all under one portfolio, your stream is important to us if it's data management, if it's data science, if it's data requirements, if it's data visualization, if it's intelligence. You are all equally valuable in the program. And so again, what we don't get is a few areas where maybe, the kind of market will tell you are the most in demand type of resource. That is not what we're trying to build. We are building a proper holistic end-to-end team where we build communities of practice, but they all come together in the same kind of stand-up sessions, the same cascades, they sit under the same portfolio, and it just encourages them to talk to each other as well. And so by having those shared meetings, shared disciplines, you also get people to understand each other more. And clearly, if you understand each other more, you've got diverse ways of thinking. The trust that builds means that you can get through the bumps that will come from your program without going, it's the IT people, or it's the data science people, or it's the people. Clearly, we have some, we have different people. Some of them work better in that mode, some of them don't. But fundamentally, we're trying desperately to make sure that the team understands they are just part of the bigger team, as opposed to being the team that are the gurus driving change, for want of a better phrase.
Oh, it's interesting. A lot of interesting bits to share just here, Stephen. Yes, and going back to even the cultural aspects, and even the sort of secret of high performance teams, and you have the combination of obviously trust, but shared vulnerability and openness and transparency. And it looks by the sort of the descriptions and things that are happening that FCA has quite a thriving culture and for its teams. Do you want to share more on the, I guess, going back to data, your data operating model? Do you want to share a bit more? I mean, outside of, I know we have quite a lot of details online and with the great brochures and graphs, but it'd be great to hear a bit of a story coming from you.
So we had a conversation at the start about how centralized we wanted to be. And we always knew that there needed to be some central leadership, clearly. And so we invested in the center first to build out the best practices, to build out the energy, to run the pilots, to really go for the creation of that vision of what we wanted to achieve, and to make sure that the understanding and the engagement was kind of controlled to some degree so that we could build a narrative. We then decided that at some point we wanted to build what we call data science units. So we created a hub and spoke model. And to be fair to the business, in some areas, there was already really quite heavily developed analytics and kind of data communities, as I said before, particularly in market oversight, but also in some of our intelligence areas, where they are always thinking about data and information. And so those areas had some good lessons as well as to what worked for them, and how they got to a good level of maturity. So we looked at that hub and spoke model where we dropped data science units and aligned them to business priority areas so that they could get to know the management team, sit on their meetings and be one of the team, so that when they're talking about new things they can do, it doesn't feel like someone externally is doing it to them. I mean, there's still a little bit of that because it's still under our kind of coordination. We still coordinate from the center. We make sure we avoid duplication. We share lessons between the kind of data science units and with the central teams. And we have a central advanced analytics team, which is run by a colleague of mine. And we have my kind of data office as it exists. But as I say, we then have these spokes scattered through the organization, where we coordinate what they're doing, what their priorities are, what their focus is, but we let them get involved with the business and then get their hands dirty on an agile basis without us needing to approve every project and all that stuff. So that's been working pretty well. And what we're looking at doing now, as we reflect upon our data ownership model, we'll be looking at rolling those skills out as well for data management, data quality staff. Again, they do exist in a couple of areas, but as we enhance our data management, data quality monitoring, as we look to have better tools around it, we are looking at also, and we've just started actually, rolling out additional data management, data quality areas into those teams. So people who understand the data, understand the business processes, are able to also show the discipline and maturity of kind of good data management and data quality. Sense of context is we have about 1,000 data sets in the FCA, and we get about 70 million items of data through the door a day. So the ability for a central team to understand all those use cases is incredibly difficult. And whilst we could centralize them all into a big team or whatever, the ability as attrition hits us to still have that business knowledge is very difficult if they're not close to the business. So it is a balance, because what we can't have is chaos where people are all doing their own thing. And we are constantly tacking that balance depending on, I suppose, how critical the central priorities are. So there are times where we're more centralized, where we direct a bit more about what we want people to work on. And there are times where we give people freedom to, go and explore stuff and see what they can do to their local areas.
Okay, that's interesting. Just trying to unpack in my head all the things that you shared. It's quite a lot, but yeah, um, interesting model. I think you've mentioned twice Agile, so I guess your teams work in using the Agile framework.
Yeah, so some of the big platform stuff is more waterfally. We had to move 50 odd thousand firms to our new collection platform over the last few months. That's not the thing we can do agile at the first cut over, but what we can do is be agile as we develop the platform going forward, as we upgrade it. Certainly most of our data science projects are done through Jira, backlogs, often sprinted. So, it's a pretty flexible thing. We don't have big project boards dominating every single project that we look after. A lot of it is done through those agile kind of capabilities and techniques. It's something we're looking at about how we can improve that. It's a constant iteration, particularly as we look at how we industrialize our projects as well. How do we link in with the IT team's needs to provide assurance and security to the products? So we're obviously constantly learning the lessons around that. But certainly most of our stuff is, in the early days, is very flexible. It's very engaging with the business. It's built with them often. And then what we look at, as I say, is how do we industrialize those services so they can spread out across the organization? And that's an area that we're still working through at the moment as we land more products. And as those products are now tested and proven in certain areas, how we expand them across the organization is an area that we're still, I suppose, working on perfecting. We've done it in some areas, but we know that we can do it faster and better. And it's a constant iteration, isn't it? You fix something, you lay it out. Over time, it just unwinds in efficiency a little bit as people get used to it. And that's why we have continuous improvement. It's why we have Six Sigma, where you're looking at how we can make those fine improvements. And we're certainly in a space where we're still moving through some of that journey.
Yeah, it makes sense. And so you, as a leader, do you have a dedicated team that, I guess, is a strategic team that looks more forward and I guess track any market changes and new priorities for your projects or even the wider FCA business outside of, I guess, day-to-day operations? Are you part of that, or?
So certainly we get involved with those teams. We have horizon scanning teams. We have teams who look after strategies for the sectors based on what the market's occurring. I don't lead those functions, but they do help drive requirements and outcomes that we might need to be dealing with. I also sit in the innovation division, where we do look at what's occurring in the external market. So the innovate function sits with us. Our reg tech function sits alongside my team. So we do constantly share, what's coming down the market, what's working, what's not, where is the thing we need to be looking at next. So we're very joined up in that space, but my teams directly don't do that because the organization does it not just for the data strategy, it does it for the whole way we regulate.
Okay, cool, fair enough. So I guess, yeah, I have before maybe hearing more about your own journey and sharing some of your wisdom. I speak to a lot of data practitioners, and I hear often them saying, and I have a friend particularly saying that she thinks that, I guess, in the data space, and she's like you, a senior practitioner in data. She thinks that we or practitioners don't think widely enough about data, and if we thought about it like researchers, we could do a lot more. Do you agree with that statement? And how
thought about what? Sorry, I missed that. If we thought about what?
About data, she basically thinks that we don't think widely enough about data, and if we thought about it like researchers, we would be thinking a lot more in terms of the possibilities and things that we could do.
Yeah, so one of our data science units does sit with our head of research. So we do quite often call upon researchers to look at certain things, and we have NDA agreements about what data they can share and what they can publish and things like that. So we do have some of that. What I do have is I also have a team called Data Advisory that sits in my area, and their job is really to problem solve. So they're not data scientists or data engineers or data analysts. They are people who know our data, know what the external world has, and they're able to almost problem solve. So an area of the business will come to them and go, I don't quite know what I want, but I know I probably want something. And so that team will go to market, we'll look at what's out there, we'll look at what we've got internally, we'll look at what other government bodies are using. We do, reach out to universities and talk to them. And then they will look at whether we need different data or different ways of using it. And so they are a bit of a troubleshooting team who will call upon the discipline areas when they need to kind of build something. But they do look at research. They do look at alternative data sources. We've spent quite a lot of time over the last 2 years acquiring sources that we didn't previously have. And as I say, I spoke only last week with our head of research, where we keep engaged with them quite a lot on what are they doing with data, what do they want to do differently. And just like the rest of the data science units, they coordinate with us the lessons they're finding, the data sets they're using, things they're acquiring, techniques they're using. So we are involved in most aspects of what the FCA does, and that obviously includes our research agenda as well. So we have econometrics and people like that who are working with us to look at how data can work for them. But because they also do the research area, we do get some engagement around the broader research piece. And our advanced analytics team over the last 3 years has spent quite a bit of time working with universities on best practice and tools and techniques and things like that. So we are quite plugged into trying to advance our thinking about what data is. We are definitely not just an organization that says, this is the data we have, how do we exploit it better? Even though clearly we care deeply about that, we are pushing the boundaries of where other data sources, other techniques might help us. And one thing we do look at as well is, if we can acquire data from another source without imposing burden upon firms, we will try and do that. So what we don't want to do is ask firms for more data if it's available on the open market, if we can acquire it for a good price, because ultimately imposing that burden on tens of thousands of firms is going to impose cost upon customers. And so we all know that whilst it may feel better for us or easier for us to do it, certainly the mindset has changed over the last few years that we need to look at those alternative sources before we reach for the kind of handbook and say, please give us more data.
That's interesting. And that's probably good as well.
I hope so. I chair the Information Governance Board at the FCA, which is a body which approves all new collections into industry. And we are constantly making sure that as people ask us to acquire new data, that we're challenging whether we have it anywhere else, whether we can acquire it from somewhere else, whether it's the right timeliness, the right level of detail. Can we ask for it to be a lower level of detail so it's easier to submit to us? Because we know from speaking to compliance teams, regulatory reporting teams, that when we ask complex questions where we're asking people to aggregate or filter their granular data, it's not always their raw data, that imposes cost on compliance teams and management approval and all that type of thing. So we've evolved our best practice thinking about what data do we acquire, what are the channels we use, what format is it in, to try and minimize the burden on firms when we acquire new data.
Fair enough. And well, I guess, and also maybe one of the layers is the burden on infrastructure. There's a cost associated to, I guess, own data as well.
There is, and also because we've got so many firms, and some of those firms are one-person companies. They don't have large infrastructure capabilities like a HSBC will have. So we constantly have to work out also about the channels of collection. We have to give some variety in that space because firms don't have some of the infrastructure need. So we do try and balance that. So we are thinking about the cost imposition on smaller firms as well as big firms.
Okay, cool. Obviously, Steve, you're the head of data, but do you want to share some stories around your the FCA's move to the cloud, or we don't have to for today's discussion?
I suppose the only thing I would say is when we talked about at the start of this chat around looking at what markets doing and exploiting the capabilities that were coming there, it clearly isn't one just based upon data science, and it's based upon digital services, it's based upon cloud architecture. So by the end of this year, we will not have a legacy data center as the FCA. It will all have moved to the cloud, and we would not be able to do some of the flexibility of data science projects that we're doing now without the scalable, ability to stand up new environments, to have large amounts of data, accessed really quickly. Our data lake is built upon cloud architecture. So we're in a situation where certainly it felt like a long journey. I think, 5 years ago internally, we decided on this strategy to move out to our data center. We are now pretty much there, but that has given us the real flexibility, the power to go after lots of different products at once. Whereas I think historically in a legacy data center where we would build each environment, we'd progress it, it would have taken us a lot longer to do some of the things we've done, particularly in the pilot mode where we're standing up new instances really quickly to try and get stuff working. So it's been very good. And it also means that as I add new data to the lake, whilst there's clearly a cost, it's not the same level of worry as if I had to buy a new storage unit. there's a lot of things that we get benefit from, and it's taken us a while to build that infrastructure around it. It takes a while to operate it properly as well, but we're in a really good place at the moment. And it's quite interesting when we talk to banks where, some of them haven't quite moved as fast, partly because they're worried about what we were saying. But certainly as an internal organization, we've moved pretty quickly on this.
It's true. And do you want to share any, I guess, any lessons for the institutions that you regulate?
So I think internally we're still reviewing. I mean, we constantly give advice and guidance. I think, I don't sit in our policy area, so we don't really talk about externally around what we're saying when it comes to supervision and the exploitation. But we've certainly learned that you can't outsource the risk. You need to put the right controls in place. You need to understand what you're doing with it. Just like we do with GDPR, where we need to understand what we're doing with our data. We need to understand where it sits, all those kind of standard best practice, where bluntly we know we can't outsource data. Therefore, we have to make sure we've got the right talent internally to understand how it hangs together and how we're using it.
Yeah, it makes sense. So we're talking about journeys, and let's talk a little bit about your journey so far at the FCA. Would you like to share with our listeners the lessons learned, and it could be from a leadership perspective, or anything in between?
So there's probably a few things. One is, as I've said before, I think a multidisciplinary team which thinks holistically is super important. It just allows us to navigate conversations much easier. It allows us to join the dots. It allows us to make sure that what we're delivering is right for the business much easier. And it also stops us being turned into a task-based function where we get a request from the business and they go, this is what you need to do. And then we deliver it and they hand it over the fence again. And they go, oh, thank you, or not thank you. Because it's much more of a evolving journey where we're with them all the way, deliver this product, then that product, you change this process, you get them this new data. It's much more of an engagement model than it is a kind of transactional, do this project, step away, come back 6 months later. So that's really good. And that's helped us be trusted so that when the business are looking at new strategies for certain areas, they will come talk to us. They don't talk to us when the strategy is written. They talk to us to help build those strategies. So they want to understand how data can drive their strategy, how it can help evolve their strategy to be better and more kind of able to deliver the outcomes they want to achieve. So we've managed to do that in quite a large number of areas now, where it's really interesting that as a data function, we are now involved in those business strategy conversations, which is really positive. So that multidisciplinary team has been really good. Alongside the engagement level, reaching out to people, understanding them before you need them. It's always a good thing to build trust before you actually need to have a transactional relationship. And certainly when we started to build the team, we were getting out there talking to people, even though we didn't know what they would need from us and what we would need from them. But just talking about the journey, talking about where we were trying to get to. And that again has helped build an environment where everybody's happy to talk to us. Everyone is happy to discuss what they need. And everyone is actually happy to come to us. They will raise stuff with us. We have a mailbox at the FCA, which is just called data, where any query, what do you want? Do you need help? They can send it to one of my teams and they triage it and allocate it around the areas. And we get hundreds of mails into that, every quarter. So it's really interesting that we've really built out that environment. And some of that has been done by things like the analytics community as well, where they've had reach out programs and stuff, outreach programs. To give you an example of how the engagement has worked, our data week 3 years ago was about 400 people. We have a week every year where we do lots of sponsored data events. We do kind of an internal ideas area. We have external speakers, internal speakers, and we normally have, between 30 and 50 events over the course of a week. We had about 450 people engaged with it 3 years ago. This spring, when we did one, I think we did one in February, we had 3,500 people engaged with it. So the journey in a very quick time has clearly moved past just the analytics and data staff and the techie staff. We've got proper business-facing activity, business-facing engagement across large areas, really deep engagement with many areas of the business, which is really positive. So that holistic team, multidisciplinary, lots of engagement, and not just when you need it. And then I always like to think, maybe from a leadership style, is transparency, pragmatism, having the difficult conversations early. I don't understand, being honest with people early can often be a bit more difficult at the start. It takes longer kind of build that trust. But it does also mean that the conversations are much easier after it. It's much easier once you've shown that you can have an honest conversation to then work through the niggles later. And so that's been really, really good, both within our teams and with the people that we serve across the rest of the FCA. And it's just interesting, I think, how the nature has changed from people who didn't understand or didn't want to be involved or thought that we were imposing ourselves upon the area of the business, to people now coming to us and asking for support and asking us to intervene, asking us to kind of support them on something that they're doing. And it does really feel like it's very kind of arm in arm, hand in hand, whatever you want to call it, with the business now when we do this work. You know, I will have very regular meetings with my fellow heads of departments and directors so that we can talk through how are they doing, how's their team feeling, what can we do for them, what's the next strategic thing we should be going after. And that just works really well. Actually, it builds a real kind of culture of trust, and it means that I can challenge the status quo without it feeling like I'm an external person who's telling them what to do. You know, I can challenge in a fair way because we've built that trust before it was needed to be called upon, I suppose. So it's been really positive. I think the other thing around culture is you've got to keep reinforcing it, because teams will fall back into silos. They will fall back to their teams they talk to. And so you've just got to keep working on it and keep tweaking it. Otherwise people will, you know, just slowly atrophy some of those capabilities. And that has been a bit difficult during COVID because people haven't been in the office. So we constantly keep trying to kind of work through that. But yeah, I could give you lots of lessons on how to build data science products and, you know, how to industrialize and how to move stuff fast through an IT environment. But that's probably less interesting. And there's many, many videos and papers on how to do that. But I do think the multidisciplinary team is the most undervalued. And you as a leader needs to reflect that. You can't have favorites. You can't ignore certain areas that maybe don't seem as interesting. You've got to get the whole team behind the program, because your data operations people are really important as well. They've got to run the ship. They've got to keep things neat and tidy. They've got to continuously improve. They've got to spot things that might not be right. So they've got to feel part of that journey, that they can change as well. They can improve. You know, as well as obviously the data scientists and the people who are landing some of the really, really, you know, complicated stuff.
I love it. I love that story. And you can probably, write an interesting book outside of the regular technical industrial books that we see out there. It's super interesting, I think, to hear those insights. And I just love it, to be honest. It's super refreshing to hear real practical, pragmatic insights that, I mean, looks like it's working. Obviously, you've highlighted a couple of sort of like challenges or things that to watch out as a leader, but that's everywhere, right? No, nothing's perfect. So any surprises on your journey so far? Things that maybe your initiatives, program, or approach did that you didn't expect?
I'm not sure whether we quite call surprise. I think certainly the way people have drawn to it who aren't historically data or IT people has been really positive. I think by having those good conversations, it's really worked to bring people with us, which is really good. And that's also included, you know, areas where we thought might be a bit guarded around it have opened up really well, actually. So I think that's a really positive surprise. I think a kind of interesting surprise from us, and it's maybe something for industry to reflect upon in this area, is that when we've spoken to a lot of external parties about their use case and their tools and their techniques and their consultancy services and things like that, when we unpack it, when we do demos or when we speak to them specifically about how it might be implemented here, the amount of configuration required and stuff is often quite demanding. And so that's always an interesting one for me, is about how difficult it can be at certain times to kind of land those ready sold products. And so that's been an interesting one for me. You know, as we talk to people and we unpack it, sometimes it's as complicated as doing it ourselves. And so there is something there about those packaged areas. And I know it's very difficult, particularly as our use cases are quite different to most organizations. You know, we're not selling to customers, you know, so our kind of workflow is quite different. But that's been a bit of a surprise. But the energy as well, I mean, it's whenever we've spoken externally, it's been really well welcomed. And I think that's actually a really good thing. People have been really interested. And I think I suspect as a regulator, we thought historically that some of our back office work around data and technology, people would be a bit less interested in because it's not direct supervision and policy work. But actually, as we've looked to share our lessons, both across government and across industry, it's been really well received, and that's been really positive. And as an organisation, we're pretty open about the fact that we want to try and make things better, not just for us, but for other people. And so I think, certainly my colleagues in the innovation division will often talk about RegTech and FinTech, and, we'll often talk about lessons learned. We run our kind of hackathons where we go after challenging industry issues, where we know that our convening power allows us to bring together agencies and people to really target kind of wicked problems. And that's been really good. And whilst that's not my team, it's not the data strategy who's driving that, it's one of my colleagues in innovation. I think sitting inside the innovation division and seeing that has been really impressive, and really liberating actually about what a regulator can do to help industry rather than just to regulate industry. And that's been super interesting in this role, even if it's not directly part of my data strategy work.
I mean, yeah, you seem like a curious person, which is great because you always want to learn, and it looks like you are, I guess, in the right environment. A lot of things are happening in the FCA. And by the way, I think it's great that FCA has a sort of culture of, I guess, maybe also an obligation to share and be present at the marketplace and share advices. But I think it's great that I really embrace that, and I really appreciate your time today with me. So before we wrap up, what are the sort of conversations or things that you think that we should discuss or start discussing in the industry?
It's an odd one. I kind of reflected on this at various conferences, and I've spoken to various people in the data industry where there's a couple of areas. One is, how can the FCA do a bit more to kind of share best practice between financial services, between ourselves and other areas? And certainly the data collection work that the Bank of England and us are driving around data standards in the UK is one area where I think we can do something quite concrete in the external area that we can help people in that space, and whilst helping ourselves. So there's certainly something there where I think you'll be hearing quite a bit of work, and then the bank will talk quite openly about the future of data collection from their mindset and how they want to push that agenda forward. And there is stuff online talking about what we're trying to achieve there, and the convening we want to do to bring industry with us. So that's a really interesting one. There's kind of interesting thing I feel is a bit of a gap still at the moment is there's a lot of work around best practice for data management, data quality. There's a lot of work on how to do data science and data analytics and things like that. There's a lot of books and stuff out there, but there seems to be very little around how to drive transformation from an end-to-end perspective. There is no best practice checklist. DCAM has a lot of things that say these are the products you should have, and these are the processes, and these are the controls and things like that. But there's very little out there from what I can see at the moment on best practice to actually land it, to embed it in business, to help that journey of people, process, tooling, data, change activity. So it's end to end. How to drive a culture that really works for your organization. And I know it's not just there isn't just a single fit. Not everything will work the same way for different firms. But even those checklists around what are the things to consider, what are the steps to take, how do you engage with the different tactics and tools and channels? It's just interesting. I've not found anything that really brings that journey together. I think it would be really useful, actually. At the moment, most of the best practice still feels like it's the colder stuff. It's the coding and the technology and the techniques and the data management, the data quality, and the data architecture, all the stuff that's super important, clearly, but the knitting it together and then getting people to care about it and getting people to accept it so that you're not just delivering products that land in people's laps and they have to work out how to get the best value from them. You're not just doing data management, data quality for the sake of control and compliance. There's just something that doesn't quite feel there. And it may be that the industry is still moving on that a little bit around that transformation that was being spoken about a couple of years ago from a more defensive chief data officer type role to a more offensive where you're adding lots of value into the business. Lots of the roles out there at the moment will talk about driving transformation now, if you can look at the job boards. And there's something there about, I'm not sure the best practice from industry, at least the published best practice. I'm sure the consultancies have lots of things they'll say to you, but that isn't quite there yet, I think, when it comes to open, available material. But there's loads of good lessons from across people. Attend your conferences, go speak to people, soak in what people have learned. But yeah, I haven't really quite managed to find that, that book or that strategy that allows us to go, this is the kind of things you should really be thinking about to really land a data-driven transformation. People have something, get in contact with me on LinkedIn, but there's certainly something there around best practice in the industry when it comes to data still feels a little bit for data professionals only.
Well, that's interesting, but now I'm thinking about it and I'm obsessed with it just like you. Maybe I should just create a Google Word file and invite all my data friends and senior data practitioners to think about it. That would be an interesting exercise. Maybe, yeah, it's a to-do list for, I guess, senior practitioners, and maybe a next project for you. Who knows? Maybe one day you will want to write a book.
IT has ITIL, data has DCAM. And it, and there's other things, there's ISO standards, and there's, CMMI maturity and all that kind of stuff, all of which touch upon data and IT and things like that. But ITIL is much deeper. It will talk about, business engagement and supplier management. The data world still feels a little bit too siloed into, your data science people and your data management people and things like that. And it's just something, it's just something that's kind of just hit me a few times when I've been doing this and when I've been in conferences, and I've just sat there and go, it doesn't feel end-to-end enough or holistic enough. It just feels like there's something missing. I can't quite scratch that itch, but there's something that I haven't quite managed to get from industry that I thought I would have gotten.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I feel you. I mean, I'm not I'm a marketer in IT, so every day I'm embedded and immersed into various literature and things published, but I guess, it's again, for me, it's one word. It's holistic. That holistic overview is key, right? Because it's never one thing. There are multiple layers and variables in the picture. It's not just tech, it's not just process. You have people, structure, but yeah. Well, Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure. I have one last question, and it's nothing related to data or the FCA, and it's just about life. I like to ask this question to my guest at the end of every show: is what are the skills and or character traits that help you so far in your life?
So I'm a history graduate, which is an interesting one, and I've led data teams and IT teams for all my working life. But the ability to, I always want to say that people dismiss kind of history and those softer sciences, but actually as a manager in this space, the ability to read thousands of pages and digest them into 6 words of an essay, actually, that's kind of what we do with data analytics. And I did, maths A level and stuff, so I kind of understand, slightly more technical stuff. But it's one of those things where the ability to do that is super important in kind of middle and senior management. And so I would say to any history graduates out there who are listening, you can kind of drive and lead data functions and IT functions and things like that, because it is super important to be able to digest lots of material and relate back to someone in an easy form. So that's the kind of first thing around skills. I would kind of go back to what I said earlier about as well, pragmatism and honesty and openness. Sometimes it leads to difficult conversations, but it normally allows you to build trust better. And so that relationship management, the taking people for a coffee, getting to know them when you don't have a task or thing you want from them, is really important around your firms, building those networks, both in and out of your firm, industry networks as well. Because when you need them, you will not have done it because you just need them. You'll have done it at the start because you wanted to. And so building those networks, those social skills, talking to people, pressing the flesh, whatever you want to talk about it, that ability is super important when you're trying to drive change. Because if you want to transform someone and you don't understand them, you will get defensiveness. It will make your journey harder. It will be vastly more difficult. And so I think certainly through my 20s and 30s, you're in a world where you're building those networks in a kind of haphazard way. But now I kind of make an active effort to make sure that I do get to know people. I used to do it just by happenstance, socializing and getting out there and stuff. But, I make an active effort now to be better at it. And it's been really productive. The networks I've built in the FCA, not because I worked with somebody on a project, but because I wanted to get to know them and I wanted to kind of build trust with them, have been super useful in this journey. I mean, hugely useful, where the ability to tie things together, to join the dots, to drive change end to end has just been made so much better by those links I've made across, the middle and senior management layers of the organization.
I think it's a great way to wrap up the show. Thank you, Steve, and come back anytime. Thank you so much. It was really cool chatting with you today. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, Afa. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the Mind Narrative podcast. If you enjoy the content, we welcome your support by contributing on Patreon. Find out more at mindnarrative.co.uk. Bye.